Hello, welcome to the Financial Times. I'm Miranda Green and I'm delighted to be joined by Lionel Barber on his very last day as editor of the paper after 14 years in the top job. Lionel, thank you very much for speaking to me today.
It's great to be here, Miranda.
It's been an extraordinary decade and a half, a really kind of tumultuous time to be at the head of an international news organisation. What for you have been the biggest moments or the biggest trends that you think have seen our world transformed in the way it has?
I think there are three big trends in the past 15 years. One would be the global financial crisis and its aftermath. If you like, there was a huge economic and financial shock. The world almost melted down in 2008.
Yeah.
And then there was a political reaction, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, the rise of populism and the anti-globalization backlash. And I think second would be the rise of the East, the rise of China, China becoming, if you like, the second superpower, economic superpower, and increasingly assertive, and India following fast behind. And then third is just the technological change, this upheaval, symbolized in a way by the smartphone, which has changed everybody's lives and certainly how media works.
So that tech change and the way that it's transforming media, do you think we are a little way along the transformation of the media industry or further along, or are we coming to somewhere where we know this new world that we're dealing with, or is there much more disruption to come, do you think?
More disruption to come. We've only just begun, in my view. There were many people who thought that the smartphone would change things maybe 1 or 2 degrees. But if you think what's the computer power of a smartphone is what the biggest computers were doing, say, 20 years ago. And we haven't even begun to see what machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to do. So for me, it's a bit man versus machines, and the journalist, we need to take back control of it.
Right, because will the AI ever manage to compete with the judgment that a good, responsible media organisation has to make every day, many times a day, in which you've been at the centre of that machine filled with humans making those judgment calls?
Yeah, I think you and I have answered the question. I mean, the journalist, the human mind cannot be replicated. I think judgment is massively important in today's media. You know all about fake news. That's an often used term. But this notion of disinformation, misinformation, what can you trust? And the FT, we've tried very hard to make it still the centre of authority, a place where you can read accurate and trustworthy news. And I think that does require judgment, curatorial judgment, human judgment. Artificial intelligence and machine learning can help us maybe sort a bit and prioritise, but I think there needs to be limits.
But data and the use of data in journalism is obviously one of those things that the technology has enabled us to do more. And obviously for a business newspaper covering finance in some detail, that's made a difference to our reporting already.
And I think been very positive influence, because we know much more about our audience now than we ever did, because we know what they're reading, what they're interested in, what they're sharing. And previously, if you like, in the newspaper age, the way you kept in touch with readers was you read the letters page, or you get a phone call from somebody who's either angry or pleased. And obviously we're on a whole different scale. That's been very important for the FT as we've grown our global audience now to almost 1.1 million paying readers.
So you talked about the financial crash and the recession that followed it, and then the political backwash from that. Do you think that's still got a lot of time to play out, that political reaction? Because clearly here in the UK, we've had the Brexit crisis and the vote, and America, we've got the Trump presidency.
The first reaction to the global financial crash was an anti-globalization, a backlash against it, the Occupy Wall Street. And then you also had concomitant with that a concentration of financial power, paradoxically. There was a crisis, banks got bigger, not smaller, less competition. I think that's a problem. But the third point, and going back to globalization, is, you know, 30 years ago, the great popular reaction and worries were about goods, the freedom of movement of goods. And then maybe during the financial crash, it's freedom of movement of capital. Actually now it's about people. And we're going to still see those demographic movements. And different politicians are drawing different conclusions. One is, if you think of tying it to the rise of the East, it's regaining control. You've got a sort of reversion towards greater nationalism and national economy rather than integrated supply chains and things like that.
And obviously you've increasingly been travelling in Asia as China has risen, the importance of India has grown massively over this period. In a sense, how has that felt being in London running a global network as the power balance shifts internationally?
I can still remember a senior Chinese diplomat just over lunch using the phrase, and it was the first time Martin Wolf, our chief economics commentator, was there, who he heard this diplomat use the word, the second superpower.
Right.
And I remember going back and Martin saying that was the big thing out of this lunch. China's never described itself in that role. Now, that was 2006. I've since made, I think, 8 or 9 trips to China, and I've seen it change. You've seen the Beijing change. You've seen the growth of these, just number of airports around China. You've seen the growth of a Chinese middle class, and now Chinese companies going global. So it's visible, it's tangible, and it's real. India also, we've got some problems now with Mr. Modi, and the economy is slowing down rapidly. But the fact is, economic power has shifted from the west to the east, and we have to capture that.
You've spent a lot of your career in Brussels and in the US, as well as in London. How does it feel with London changing its relationship with Europe and with the States as well? I mean, it's a real moment of flux.
Well, I'm still confident in the City of London because I think it's one of the world's great financial centres, and I don't worry about London's relationship to the EU. The EU does not have a comparable financial centre, and I don't think it's going to have one anytime soon. It's not going to be Paris, not going to be Frankfurt. New York, by comparison, may benefit if we from divergence of the London from Europe, New York, and they've got the big banks. So that's the thing to watch there. I worry more about how the rest of the country is going to adapt to post-Brexit. I think there are some great centres of excellence, like Cambridge. I think Manchester is becoming a great city, linked to the university as well. But there are other places, and we know about the seaside towns, where they're still very vulnerable, and no amount of huge public spending is going to arrest that.
So thinking about the extraordinary access that we at the FT have as a preeminent global international news organisation, I mean, certainly as a reporter, I've always found it incredible what you can find out as an FT journalist. But, you know, the financial crash, having this incredible ability to talk to these leaders around the world, how does that feel, balancing that with the journalistic killer instinct to get the story and to hold people to account?
Well, access is two-edged because you talk to primary sources, but then it's easy with access to be captured. So in a way, I've always taken the view that you have to be inside, close enough to see the whites of their eyes, but then to detach and then write from a slight distance. Now, obviously, the more intimate the relationship, the more dangerous that relationship is. And I remember going to see, being invited, indeed, getting the call in the first week of taking over as an editor in 2005. And who should it be? It's Downing Street and Tony Blair. And within 3 weeks, I'm on the sofa talking to the Prime Minister. And
being wooed.
Yeah, well, you know, it was just interesting. But I think one always has to bear in mind the lines. So access always has to be for a purpose, and you can never sort of have people, if people threaten access, either to me or to FT journalists, I've always said, well, I don't care. We're still going to write about you. And that's happened a number of times. But you're right. I mean, I think At times, I've worried a bit about whether we're a little too close. I mean, we're obviously a business newspaper. We want to write about the real people and not just, we've got to invite, well, when I say the real people, I'm talking about it's good to have access to board members and CEOs, people who are exercising power. But you also need to talk to other people involved, like investors and the accountants, etc. So multiple sources is the way to deal with access problem.
So you've had this very interesting interview with Angela Merkel today on your last day, a few months ago, fascinating interview with Vladimir Putin. What have been the sort of high points for you of these extraordinary figures who you've had this incredible level of access to explain their worldview through us, through the FT?
Well, it's one of the great privileges of being editor. I've been very lucky. I wanted to still do journalism, and I figured that one way to do it and plant the standard, if you like, was go and see the people who run countries, run businesses, but particularly political leaders, because I'm interested in power. I've always been fascinated by it. So the Putin interview after midnight in the Kremlin was really interesting. I mean, Russia's back on the world stage, North Africa, Middle East, etc. And seeing him talk about that was very interesting. And then, of course, he gave the big line, which was the liberal idea is obsolete. And so the Merkel interview, Chancellor Merkel, was, if you like, the anti-Putin interview. I wanted to do a bookend, and I'm very interested in Germany, speak German, study German at university. So for me, it was a nice end piece. But I think probably the highlights of all were maybe being in Tehran and meeting ex-President Rafsanjani, great historical figure, and then seeing Rouhani at the end. That was very, just hadn't been there ever to Iran. I think being in the White House with President Trump, he was a bit disappointed that when he said, "Have you been to the Oval Office? Nice place." And I said, "Well, actually, I have, 20 years before, but didn't want to name drop." No. And then this interview with President Trump was quite special. But for me, overall, probably on balance, was Putin in the Kremlin after midnight.
So you brought up his amazing line, which we splashed across the front page: "The liberal idea is obsolete." Angela Merkel today giving us the counterpoint, as you've said. Do you think? What about the FT's values, though? Because in a sense, the FT also has a kind of liberal worldview.
Well, we've defended that, and our columnists have defended it, and it's correct to do so because we do believe in globalization. We know that globalization has lifted billions out of poverty. You've seen that in China, in India. And we also are tolerant, open-minded people. We believe in immigration, if you're going to have lots and lots of immigration, you maybe need to think about how it might affect public services and communities and have spending to offset that. But in terms of, again, I've spent more than 10 years in America. I've seen immigration has been a tremendous force of renewal and prosperity in America. And energy, exactly. So those values the FT needs to defend and will continue to defend. But I also think going forward that we need to offer solutions. We need to recognize and explain how maybe the world has changed a bit after Brexit, after the election of Trump. This is not to condone what he's saying or sometimes what he's doing, but just to understand if the world has changed, to take account of that, but also to provide solutions to problems and not just say, look backwards. I think that's important for a newspaper like the FT. And I think the other thing I'd say, because you talked about interviews, it's not just the big countries. One of the great enjoyments for me has been to spend time in Africa. I've done at least 6-7 trips to South Africa. Was in Rwanda, had a fascinating 3.5-hour interview with President Kagame, who's been a figure in power for 20 years, controversial figure, but a serious, deeply serious figure. And then the Nobel laureate, Mr. Abiy in Ethiopia. So it's those things as well as the big names that have been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you very much for joining me, and also thank you for hiring me.
It was always a strategic decision, Miranda. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.